Good evening. Thank you for coming. We ran out of handouts, in case you didn't know. There are two options. I'm going to go print some more. I don't know how many more to print, but we'll figure it out.
Raise your hand if you need a handout still.
There you go. Good call. Yeah, I'll make 20 of them. Or I'm going to put it online as a PDF on our website, People's University page. There'll be a link to it if you just want to get them that way. Okay? And these are some of the books that were recommended. We're getting all of them that were on the recommended books list. Welcome to People's University. And if you'll turn your cell phones off, please. A couple announcements. Tuesday the 10th at noon, we have an interesting new archival collection of digitized 16mm films from the 30s that, believe it or not, are in full color, made by John Welty. That John Welty of Wheeling. And they're just fascinating. They're of Ogilvy Park skiing and the Christmas parade, I think one of the earliest, if not the first Christmas parade, in full color. So we'll be taking a look at those. There's no sound, so we'll play some music, and that'll be on Tuesday. And then on the 17th, Daryl Clausell will be here to tell us about the Pythian, the African-American Pythian building on Chaplin Street, and some of its history. We just did an oral history interview with a group of people who have memories of it, and tell you all about that. Next week, on the 12th, Laura will be back to talk about the pharaohs in Egypt, Part 2. It'll be at 7 as well. Now, like with the dinosaur program, we're arranging for 20 attendees to visit the Carnegie Museum for a tour of the Walton Hall of Ancient Egypt, with a natural history interpreter, tour guide. And this will take place a week after our last class, the last class is February 23rd. So the tour will be on March 2nd at 6 p.m. and we'll meet at the Carnegie. We're going to have to limit it to 20. So people who attend the most classes will get priority. And if we have more than 20 who want to go, we'll have to draw names for it. So I'm going to pass around a sign-out sheet in a minute or two. And if you just put your name down if you're interested in the tour on March 2nd. Okay, our instructor tonight is Dr. MICHELE DIENER. She has taught ancient and medieval history at Marshall University since 2008. She's won several awards for teaching. She received her PhD in history from the Ohio State University, and has studied at Vassar College, Newnham College, Cambridge, and most recently, Vermont College of Fine Arts. Please welcome Dr. MICHELE DIENER.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me. And as Sean said, I'm going to be with you for a while. I'll be here tonight, next week. Then a colleague of mine will be here for 2 weeks talking about ancient Greece. And then I will be back for many sessions. We're going to look at late Egypt and then go into Rome. So I look forward to spending the next 2 months or so with you. Given that the handout that I gave you tonight is really just for tonight, so I'll be following up on it, giving you lots more. I love handouts. I also put my email address on the handout, and I'm really easy to look up. Like if you just Google me and Marshall University, you'll figure out how to contact me. So if you have any questions or anything that you didn't get to ask or that is unclear, by all means, just let me know. And feel free to ask questions throughout. I'm envisioning this more like a class than a formal lecture. So please feel free to stop me and ask me questions. So is the sound okay? Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So along with that, I think the pictures up there, they're somewhat small. So if there's anything you want to go back and look at more closely, I'm happy to send you the PowerPoint. But also on the back of the handout, I put a number of the websites where I got some of the images, and most of them, if they're not directly listed there, I get from the British Museum. They have a fantastic website for Egyptology. So anyway, as Sean said, I'm Laura Michele Diener. I teach ancient and medieval history and a number of other things at Marshall University. Ancient history is something that I sort of fell into because I was hired there as a medievalist, but we didn't have an ancient historian. And the way I see it, it's really hard to understand the Middle Ages without understanding the ancient world. You can't understand medieval Europe unless you know about Rome. And you certainly can't figure out what's going on with Rome unless you know about the Hellenistic kingdoms. And you don't know about them unless you know about the Greeks. And if you're going to look at the Greeks, you might as well look at the Persians. And the Persians only make sense in context with the Egyptians. So I sort of became the ancient historian because I just felt like we needed to start at the beginning. So ancient history is a love for me, as are the Middle Ages, because I just see such continuities in them. And in terms of continuities, Egypt has continuities that last for thousands of years and even beyond. I think that if we were doing a different series, if we were looking maybe at early medieval, the early medieval Mediterranean, or the origins of Christianity, we would still spend a lot of time in Egypt, and we would see how some of the images of Egyptian art, even under the Romans, both look backwards to some of the earliest images of the gods, and also look forward to medieval Christian art. So Egyptian culture is a long time. It's full of continuities. But having said that, ancient Egypt as a term doesn't really work very well. That's because looking at Egypt just at its height, at when it was a great ancient superpower, we're looking at over 3,000 years. So how can we just use one word like ancient to look at 3,000 years? I'm sure you've heard this saying before. It's like all on TikTok and everything now. My kids are always telling me about how Cleopatra would have considered the pyramids to be ancient. But yet we refer to both Cleopatra and the pyramids as ancient Egyptians. So I think then when historians and archaeologists look at Egypt, they don't use a word like ancient. They look at more specific historical periods to get a sense not just of the continuities, but also of the changes. So for example, the pyramids were really at their height during one specific dynasty. Different gods were worshipped at different periods. Even hieroglyphs were, they evolved and changed depending on what period we're in. So I thought I'd start out by introducing you to some of the historical periods that archaeologists and historians use for Egyptology. So I included this in your handout, but you can see that we break this down into different periods, and based on the questions I got while I was passing around handouts, a number of you are actually familiar with this concept and are pretty advanced, actually. So the earliest one I gave you was the pre-dynastic period. Now, of course, there are people in Egypt, in this area, before 5300 BC, but when we're trying to sort of trace cultural origins, that's just where I decided to start tonight. So that's considered the pre-dynastic period. We then have the early dynastic period. And what we're talking about with dynasties are ruling families. So there's about 30 dynasties altogether, although historians are always shifting our knowledge of dynasties. You'll see from the handout there's a dynasty 0 because in the 1920s they discovered some evidence that there was a dynasty before the dynasty 1 that they had already counted. Also, there was sort of a missing dynasty that was slowly uncovered during the late 19th and early 20th century. The famous New Kingdom rulers, the family of Tutankhamun and Akhenaten, all of them had been actually erased from history and had to be added back in. So we're always sort of shifting our perspective of how many dynasties there were. But so a continuous family line of rulers makes up a dynasty. And as you can see from the early dynasties, there's a lot of question marks and, not clear years or clear names. There's not names for every year. So the further back we are, the less clear we are. When we're in that pre-dynastic period, that means that Egypt was not unified. And any local rulers we don't have a ton of evidence for. As we go forward, you'll see that we get to the Old Kingdom, and that's followed by something known as the First Intermediate Period, followed by the Middle Kingdom. And we're going to talk about what happens after that next week. But the idea behind that is that there are kingdoms and there are intermediate periods. And so what that means, when we have an old kingdom, a middle kingdom, and then there's going to be a new kingdom and a late kingdom, we mean that all of Egypt is unified under one ruler, ruling as from a centralized point with a government that stretches over all of Egypt. In particular, Upper and Lower Egypt. So I have this map here, and a lot of you probably know this, but Upper and Lower Egypt follow the flow of the Nile as opposed to the north-south orientation, so you have to flip it in your mind. So Upper Egypt is actually in the south because of the way that the Nile flows. It always takes me a minute. I have to think about this in my mind. And Lower Egypt is the north, this delta area that goes out like a fan, and that's because of the way the Nile is flowing upwards. So during the periods that are kingdoms, the upper and lower areas are ruled by one king, or could be a queen, a ruler. During the intermediate period, so we have a first, a second, we have later ones, that means that they are split, and there's at least two rulers who are, competing for control and have separate dynasties and are ruling regional areas. Now, if you read Egyptian sources where they're writing about this themselves, they refer to the kingdoms as the glory days when everything is wonderful, and the intermediate periods as times of complete chaos, war, famine, destruction, everything awful. That's because those sources are usually written at the behest of a king who's trying to convince everyone that things were awful before they came to the throne and will be awful should they be taken off the throne. As archaeologists, pursue excavations, outside of sort of key central areas, we do start to get another picture, which is that the intermediate periods tended to be times when local areas flourish. We sometimes see a lot of social mobility because there's not such tight central government control. So that's just a way to kind of keep ourselves oriented. So I'll be referring to dynasties within periods or within kingdoms. So that's one way to look at ancient Egypt, is through chronology. And as we get into the different dynasties, we can try and match them up with our dating system. Now, it's difficult because the Egyptians did not use our dating system, and they certainly didn't divide themselves into kingdoms and periods. Like, they didn't know they were in the second intermediate period. They counted time by the regnal years of the ruler. So they would say, in the second year of the reign of King Thutmose I, which can be really difficult for us because we might not know what year Thutmose first came to the throne. So that can be really difficult for us. So most of the time, we're kind of approximating things, especially for the earlier periods. Now, as we get into later Egypt, it becomes a little bit easier because we have other chronologies. You know, we have Greek historians to work with. We've got events going on with the Persians. We just have things that we can use the dates comparatively with. So chronology, well, I did not need to do that. Let's see. There we go. No. There we go. Chronology is one way to consider ancient Egyptian history. Another way is geography and the natural world. And it's probably no surprise to any of you how important the natural world was to the way that Egyptian culture shaped itself. Just even considering the way they oriented their world is not according to north and south, but rather to the flow of the Nile. And that might be a little hard to see, but that is actually, it's from a book I put on here by Toby Wilkinson, but it's the Egyptian conception of their world, and it's the map flipped. So you can see that this is actually the north, that's the Delta area, and they saw that as basically the south. Now, one of the major geographic keys to understanding the way Egyptian culture developed was the difference they had between the kinds of land they lived in. And we see two terms, the Deshret and the Kemet. So both of those lands have to do with their proximity to the Nile. So of course, the Nile is entirely central in how the Egyptians understood themselves and their place in the world. And really how other people saw it as well. There's a later historian, Herodotus, who wrote in Greek. He's most famous for writing about the Persian Wars, and I will keep referring to him. He keeps coming up. But he has a whole chapter just on Egypt, and he refers to Egypt as the gift of the Nile. Basically understanding that Egypt exists because of the Nile, its function, its flow, its direction, and what it gives to the people. And so the Kemet is the black land that flows on either side of the banks of the Nile. It's the fertile land. And it's a black, that's also kind of a blackish green, which means that if you look at Egyptian art, if you read Egyptian literature, black is an incredibly positive color. It is the color of life. It's the color of rebirth, of fertility, of good things, as is green. And green and black kind of work together that way. So if you're thinking of later images of Osiris, he's frequently black or green. Yes, which is a positive thing. So, because he's also the god of like rebirth and not death, not as an end. So black and green means, you know, death not as an end, but rather as a part of life. It's a good question. So the other land is the Deshret, which is where our word desert comes from. That is the red land. And the red land is the land beyond the Kemet. It is the land of danger. It is the land of the scary kind of death, like the death that will happen to you if you run out of water or are attacked by bandits or something like that. So red is a terrifying color. So the Egyptians saw their world in terms of the Deshret and the Kemet. One of the books that's on the recommended list by Barbara Mertz is Red Land, Black Land, which is a great way to consider the history of Egypt. Now, having said that, both the Deshret and the Kemet offer important gifts. So, of course, the Kemet is the land where the crops grow. It's the fertile land, which doesn't mean it's not without its own dangers, because it is the land that is fertilized when the banks of the Nile overflow during the rainy season, and it's the sort of the black silt that's deposited, that's the fertile land, but of course if it floods too much, that's destruction. Now, the red land, the Deshret, is the desert, which is scary, but the desert also yields a great deal of riches. That's where Egypt got a number of its precious stones, its mineral resources, and also its building materials for most of its major projects. So the Deshret is seen as scary, but also necessary, part of an equilibrium. And that idea of equilibrium runs through Egyptian thought pretty continuously. The term is ma'at, this idea of duality and balance, that everything must be balanced. So you need kemet, but you can't have too much because then there's a flood and it's destructive. You do need the Deshret, but of course you don't want to get lost in it or anything like that. Ma'at, M-A, little apostrophe, A-A-T. And Ma'at is sometimes personified as a goddess with wings as well. So later on, we'll see some pictures of that. Now, when there's war, famine, floods, there is no Ma'at. And something is out of balance. Usually that means the ruler is not in proper balance with the gods. But when things run smoothly, there is Ma'at. So pictures. Okay, these are just images showing the flow of the Nile and the way there's actually, there we go, 2 tributaries of the Nile. So they're coming from what today would have been Rwanda and the Sudan, and they flow north to meet and create the Egyptian Nile. Now, here we have the Deshret. So you can see it really does look red. It's red, it's menacing. And this is the Kemet, and this in particular is the Delta region in Lower Egypt. It's very marshy and wet and lush. As we get into Upper Egypt, the contrast between the Kemet and the Deshret gets more severe. Yes?
I'm a little confused.
Okay.
You showed Deshret up there, then you said it was red. I thought Deshret was green and white.
The Deshret is the desert red land, and the Kemet is the black-green fertile land. So if we're looking, let's say, at this picture right here, anything that is green is considered Kemet, and anything, it's not really red on this sort of satellite picture, it's kind of brownish, that's the Deshret, the idea of the red land. So this is a good way of thinking of the Deshret. Oh, well, I could easily have said that. I say all kinds of crazy things. Now, as we also get further south into Upper Egypt, the Nile also gets a little more scary to traverse because we have a number of cataracts, which are sort of rocky areas creating waterfalls. And in that one book, Red Land, Black Land, one of the earliest chapters is an imagined tour down the Nile describing the different sites you'll see. So I highly recommend that book. Now, when we see Egyptian images of the Nile and the Kemet, we can see the kinds of positive associations they have with them. So this image is from the Metropolitan Museum, and this is from a tomb, and you can see it's a family hunting party, or sailing party, I guess. They're hunting birds and they're fishing. They're on a little boat. This is Nebamun. This is his wife. This is his daughter. And they're sailing through the Nile surrounded by abundance. There's waterfowl, there's fish, and there's plants that can be made into cloth or paper. So when we see depictions of the Nile and the Kemet surrounding it, it's always really lush and plentiful and a really positive place to be. And here's another one. This is another tomb. You can see all of the fish, the lushness. So the Egyptians really saw the Nile as the place of bounty, of lushness. Now, Given that, the Kemet has to be preserved. That land can't be thrown away. It's got to be utilized for important things. But the Egyptians had always utilized the land that most gave them the food, the riches, the resources that they needed. So in the earlier Egyptian cultures, before the Nile was flooding regularly, it was actually a swamp. So this is, you're looking at that very early pre-dynastic period, the Badarian, and even before that. So before we get to the kings that we can look at, most Egyptians lived in the Sahara, which of course became the desert. But the Sahara at that point was actually more like a savanna, teeming with animals, and instead of being farmers, Egyptians were herders. They traveled with their herds from water place to water place, and they actually avoided the Nile because it was a swamp at that point. And we have some markings of theirs from when they lived in the savanna, which now is complete desert, but these show people swimming. They're marks in a cave. It's the Cave of Swimmers in the Sahara Desert. It was made really famous by that movie, The English Patient, if anyone has seen that. But that was when the Egyptians were herders and they lived in the savanna. And we find archaeological evidence of their sacrifices, of how they moved with their cattle from watering place to watering place. And it was only about 5500 BC that they moved into the Nile. That's when the climate changed, the savanna dried up into the desert, and the swampiness of the Nile became more like the Kemet that we know today. So that's when Egyptians started to move around the Nile, and they became farmers for the most part instead of herders. And we have some evidence of those early Egyptian civilizations that lived around the Nile. And they're on your handouts. There's the Badarian, and then there's 3 different civilizations known as Cleopatra. And that's when we see the beginnings of Egyptian agriculture. Now, we don't know a ton about these early Egyptians living along the Nile because they hadn't developed a complex writing system yet. So we don't have any great sources. We don't have any letters or diaries or anything that says, today we started farming for the first time. It was very exciting. These were the tools we used. Instead, we have archaeological evidence, most of which comes from graves. And there are several thousands of graves coming from those earliest civilizations. Now, they can tell us a surprising amount. There are some things they can't tell us at all. We have no idea what these people called themselves. Instead, we name them after the modern areas where the major sites were found. So we have the Badarian culture is just named after a key site that was found at Badari. And then we have the Cleopatra cultures, which were just named after a town called Cleopatra, where there was a huge grave site that was discovered in the 1920s by an archaeologist named Flinders Petrie. Now, on your handout, I put Nakata 1, 2, 3, which makes very little sense. Historically, no one at the time said, I'm living in Nakata 2. It's based on careful cataloging of the kinds of pottery that people were buried with to show how long that culture must have lasted. So we have a lot of evidence based on the world of the dead. Some of the earliest burials, particularly from the Badarian period, are pot burials, which are really interesting. This is a huge pot. You can tell it's a really big pot because it has a person in it. And go there. We also have graveyards with graves where the bodies are preserved. Now, these are not Egyptian mummies. They're not mummified the way we would think, wrapped in bandages, chemicals, all of that. And they're not buried in amazing rock tombs or with great treasures, but they are buried with goods, with what archaeologists call grave goods. The culture was not at the level where they had, golden thrones and things like that, but most graves have some kind of grave good. It could be a pot of eye makeup, it could be some pottery, it could be some jewelry, and sometimes people are buried with animals. Sometimes the graves are single, sometimes they're double, there's a mother and an infant. Sometimes it's impossible to tell what's going on because the bodies and the bones are so degraded. This is one, jumping ahead there, one Nakata grave, and you can see this is the body, the way it's buried. It's curled up like that. These blobs indicate grave goods, and these are some of the grave goods. There's a lapis lazuli pendant, which actually indicates that they're already trading with the Mesopotamians since they're getting lapis lazuli. There's this beaded bracelet, and there's this, which is part of an ivory comb. So I know I emphasized all the distinct historical periods, but we can see that the idea of grave goods goes back to the earliest societies along the Nile. Now, this is one of the famous Nakata burials. This is Gebelein Man. He's currently at the British Museum. Has anyone seen him in person? It's pretty interesting because he's on the floor. They've sort of reconstructed this grave, so you're just walking along. I'm like, oh my goodness, okay. There's a body right there. But you can see something really interesting here. He is naturally mummified. He was buried directly in the earth, and there's just sort of regular the heat, the sands, the natron, which is a naturally occurring chemical in the ground. All of that basically naturally mummifies bodies. You can even see his hair and his nails. And so that's what happens when you bury bodies in the dirt. They become natural mummies. And he's surrounded by pots, by a number of grave goods, not, again, great treasures, but things that were considered important enough to be buried with him. Well, because it's cooked by, the sand, the sun, basically dehydrated. It doesn't look that much different from an artificial mummy, but it's actually better preserved than an artificial mummy. Yes? They were able to tell how he died only recently. This was excavated in the early part of the 20th century. Since then, CT scanning, DNA, all those, forensic anthropology has developed. He was actually stabbed in the back of all things. So he did not have a good end, but he's having a great afterlife. You can even see his hair, which is pretty remarkable. Now, natural mummies are not unique to Egypt. They occur whenever the climate, the land, the situation is right. Here's a famous mummy. This is from Turkestan. It's part of a set known as the Urimchi mummies. So this is 1000 BC, I should have written. You can see he's got a beard, his hair, he's even got leg warmers. And that's because he was a salt worker. He worked in salt mines, and salt is one of the best natural preservatives. This is a baby that's part of that mummy group that was also preserved. And this is Lindau Man, also in the British Museum, and he is from Britain. This was discovered in 1985. Lindau Man was buried in peat. Peat also acts as a natural preservative. So you can even see that, you can see his fingernails, you can see his hair. He also did not meet a good end. He was poisoned, garroted, and bashed in the head. So they really wanted him dead. But the fact that people's bodies mummified naturally meant that when the Egyptians thought of dead bodies and death, they didn't think of a skeleton or rotting flesh the way we do. They thought of a preserved, albeit shriveled body. So that meant that that's their idea of death. Later, as we go forward in time, the society becomes more complex, wealthier. They want to start burying the wealthier people in more elaborate ways. They start using stone tombs. That means that the bodies they're going to decompose, and that can't happen because that's not what death looks like. For thousands of years, people thought that death looked like that. So that's why they start experimenting with mummification, the not natural kind, to try and get bodies back to what they thought they should look like after death, the way they were naturally. Now, the mummies that we see in museums are all people who could afford to have their bodies mummified in later periods. So there were poor people who, 3,000 years after Ghibelline Man, were still being mummified naturally, in the ground. And that's another interesting difference between the Kemet and the Deshret. You can't bury bodies in the Kemet. You need that specifically for the living. That's where you grow your crops. You put your bodies in the Deshret, which is another reason that Deshret is associated with death, but not necessarily in, a completely finite, horrible way. So we don't know as much as we want to know about the Badarian and the Naquata people. But we do know quite a bit, and we're learning more all the time. One of the really interesting parts of the handout, I think, that I gave you is evidence from one particular Naquata cemetery where enough of the bodies were preserved that with forensic anthropology today, they were able to tell roughly sex, age of death, and let's see, where's my handout? It's the colorful one. And you know what? It did not print out correctly at all because you don't actually see the gender. So that, instead of actually looking at that handout, I'll have you follow that link. It somehow didn't print out correctly. But you can see at least that the greatest number of bodies are between kind of 15 and 35. That seems to be the real height. And then there's, and then you can see between 55 and 60 is about as old as anyone would get. And there's a significant number of deaths, basically pre-5 years old. So that can be confusing to look at because it didn't quite print out correctly, but there's a link to it so you can look at it online at the University of College website, which actually follows pretty regularly sort of pre-industrial death patterns. So for the Naquata people, if you could make it to about age 5, you had a pretty good chance of living to being in your teens. Most people, though, did not survive to the age of 5 because of epidemics. Once you were in your teens, you faced other difficulties, hunting, accidents, or childbirth. But if you could survive that, you could live, probably like through your 40s, 50s, but not much longer. So that's just some sort of sparse evidence we have because a lot of bodies they can't be dated, they can't be gendered or anything like that. But seems like there's a new technology every day that kind of gives us greater insight. So one thing we do know is that during that Naquata 3, that later period, we start to see greater political organization, and we get the earliest people who can be termed Egyptian kings. Now, they're not really pharaohs. That's because pharaoh is a word that doesn't come about until the New Kingdom. We're just going to call them kings. It's easier. We think of them as pharaohs. Pharaoh was actually invented by a woman ruler, Hatshepsut, because she needed a name that didn't refer to a king. We're going to talk about her next week. But we start to see unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and the idea of kingship in Nakota 3. Now, how do we know this? There are a few objects that really indicate that we have people who are considering themselves rulers. They're at least trying to be rulers. So one of these is the mace head of King Scorpion. This is probably the earliest artifact of kingship that we have. So what is a mace head? A mace is a big weapon. It's like a staff that's got a big stone circle at the end, and you can use it like to bash people over the head. This is the mace head. It is huge. I mean, it's not huge, but it's like a vase. I don't know that it was necessarily really used as a weapon. It was probably more symbolic, but it shows this guy. So this is a close-up. We call him King Scorpion because we don't know his name, and there's a picture of a scorpion next to him. Now, how do we know that he was a king and not just some random guy? He's wearing the white crown of Egypt. So we've talked about differences. There's a lot of continuities. The white crown of Egypt, which kind of looks like a bowling ball, is a crown that we first see with King Scorpion. So this is, 3000 BC, but we see it on depictions going into the New Kingdom and beyond. That's and that's the red crown, and sometimes they're worn together or sometimes they're worn separately. Now, we also have an object known as the Narmer palette. Now, both of these objects were found in a temple at Hierakonpolis, and it's inside the remains of a town where there was a temple dedicated to worship of the god Horus. Now, Horus is one of the earliest Egyptian gods that we find references to. I know that when you learn about Egyptian mythology, you learn about Osiris and Isis and all the myths and stories relating to them. A lot of that comes later, or at least it's written down later. And it seems like the different family dynamics, like Isis and Osiris being brother and sister and all of that, maybe developed as part of later mythology. But some of the earliest references we see in images are to the god Horus, who is associated both with kings and falcons. There's a lot more to him, but when we see these early depictions, we always see him in conjunction with royalty and with falcons. So this is the Narmer palette, and it is one of the key objects that tells us that Upper and Lower Egypt are now fused under one ruler, or it might be wishful thinking, but there's at least a ruler who says that he is going to fuse both of them together. Now, this is a stone palette. It's pretty big. It's like this big. And it's actually a makeup palette. So it's a really, really ornate makeup palette. And what would happen, there'd be coal, and then, which is powdery, and you would use the palette as a base to mix it with animal fat, usually to make it into more of a liquid makeup, and you would, bless you, use it around your eyes. Now, that was something that men as well as women did because for two reasons, really, to block the sun and also, bless you, to prevent infection as well. So most people wore makeup in ancient Egypt, or eye makeup, and pots of makeup. They're some of the earliest objects you find in Nakota graves. So this is really big, so it's probably ceremonial. So it quite possibly was used as a makeup palette for a statue, possibly of Horus or another god, and priest used it to decorate the statue with makeup. That's just a guess, but the imagery on it is pretty significant. So this shows the flip side. On this side, we have a guy who is wearing the white crown, and he is in smiting pose. So I know that can be really, okay, that's a little bit of a better picture for you. So that is the white crown. And you can see that he is holding a mace head. So that's what that mace head is. He's holding a whole mace there. And so it's got the white crown. He has a prisoner seized in his hand, and that picture, like holding guy, like smiting like that, you will see that through like the Ptolemies. And for thousands of years, that's how kings are depicted. They are warriors. Of course, and he's also wearing the false beard, which is another symbol of kingship that you will see over many thousands of years, to the point that when there are female rulers, they wear the false beard too, because it symbolizes king more than anything else. Now, sorry, that's the obverse side. So when you see that, we have another king who is wearing the red crown. So they can be worn, sorry, super sensitive, separately or together. And he has a mace. He also has the crook and the flail, which you frequently see. Osiris has them, kings are depicted on them. They're agricultural implements, but they're ceremonially carried by kings. So this is full of kingship imagery. Now, what in the world is he doing? Well, he's about to kill a prisoner there, or kill somebody. Here, he seems to be overseeing possibly some soldiers, but all along this way, we have a number of headless people. We can tell they're headless, they're bound, they don't have heads, and it looks like their heads are down at the ground. We've also got falcons everywhere. So this basically tells us that this is an image of a very powerful king who has conquered by blood. He rules by blood and terror and battle, which is actually really good. That was one of the key roles of Egyptian kings, was to be warriors, to keep everyone sort of in their place. Now, we call this the Narmer palette because we call this king Narmer, and that's because of this mark right here. So that's where it is on the larger palette. That's a close-up of it. So it's an image of a fish and an image of a chisel. And if you're using them in how those symbols translate into Egyptian, it's nar, mer, fish, chisel. So this is at a point where hieroglyphs have not developed into the kind of language we have where a symbol means a sound and you can put all those sounds together to form a word. It's at the point still where a symbol means the symbol it stands for. So if you have a fish, you read it as fish as opposed to a particular sound. So he's king fish chisel, and that's their way of depicting it. Now he is on your handout. We've placed him. You can find him as the first king of the first dynasty of the early dynastic period. Was that his real name? Was he actually the first king of the first dynasty? We have no idea. But we do know that that's a good starting place when we're talking about a united Egypt with a central ruler who saw himself basically as a ruler. All right, so in this early dynastic period, we have a lot of basically kings. We're not necessarily sure who they were when they ruled. The king list is really, it's really vague. We don't know a lot about their families or anything like that. We don't know much about them individually at all. All we know about these early kings, we know they ruled from the city of Memphis. We know that they grew in power, that they were able to conquer their one unguarded border, which was to the south, and they were able to go into, it's an area they called Nubia, and maintain control and bring back prisoners. Everywhere else, they're protected either by the sea or the Deshret. And we know that their building power continues to increase. But most of the time, all we really know about any of those kings or their families is just a name, frequently a name that's in a seal that might be in one of their tombs. Or their name might be written on what's known as a stela. So a stela is a big stone tablet, and that's how Egyptians made pronouncements or announcements. So if you're going to find the name of a king, you'll frequently find it on a stela. The Rosetta Stone is a stela. It's basically like a big stone tablet that announces things. Occasionally, we get references to family members that are preserved. This is a really interesting one. This is Princess Nefertari, which means the beautiful one coming from the east. She was daughter of a 4th dynasty ruler. And this is her and her food, and it's a beautifully preserved stela in a tomb associated with her family, and she has got a really fantastic dress made out of a panther. So that's a rare exception to us not knowing a ton about their families or anything like that. It's when we start to get to the 4th dynasty, and so that is on the second page of your handout. The 4th dynasty is where we really start to know more about the kings. That's because the 4th dynasty is really when the pyramids happen. That is the height of the pyramids. So I mentioned earlier, Cleopatra would have thought the pyramids were ancient because they were thousands of years before. The pyramids are really a part of this one particular period. And why is that? There's been a number of theories. Why have a pyramid? Why have them now? Why have them in the shape that they're in? The most, I think, popular common theory is that it just makes sense because we go from having Gebelin Man, like buried in the dirt, and then eventually, people want to protect their dead, they want to protect it from animals and scavengers, so they start putting them a little lower down and covering up the grave with a stone slab. That gets more elaborate. We get kind of a stone bench. It's known as a mastaba, which is a later Arabic word, but it's basically like a stone coffin rectangular thing that marks the spot where someone is buried. Over time, they get more elaborate, and the deceased person is buried further down in the ground, and there can be a staircase leading to the mastaba. But that's all well and good. But what if you're a king and you're really powerful? You want your mastaba to be higher than anybody else's mastaba. So you just keep building squares and rectangles on top of each other, like mastabas on top of mastabas, till you get a really tall one. So that's one major theory about the pyramids, that if you keep building on top of a mastaba, that's basically what you get. Because the earliest pyramids are not smooth, they're step pyramids. So this is the step pyramid. This is a modern picture. You can see how it really is sort of built up naturally. Now, there's other arguments. Some argue that the point represents the rays of the sun or the primeval mound rising out of the earth. Those can actually all be true, really. Now, it also takes people a while through the 4th dynasty to create the famous pyramid shape. So, okay, this is the step pyramid, and this is a good way to see inside it. I put the book I got this picture from on your outline, but you can see how the burial vault is underground, there's stairs, and then this is like the original mastaba, and then it just goes up. Now, it takes a while to figure out how to do this. This is the bent pyramid. It's the pyramid that didn't work, basically. It just didn't really happen. There's also pyramids that are now just heaps of rubble because they just gave up midway because they realized that this was never going to happen. Now, I'll come back to that. The masterpiece of pyramids are the pyramids of Giza, and they are really built just in one period during the fourth dynasty. So Sneferu, he is the one who has the step pyramid, and then it's his son, Khufu, who builds sort of the Great Pyramids of Giza that we think of when we think of the pyramids. Now, when I see pictures of the pyramids, or when I think of the pyramids, they look really isolated. They look like they're out in the middle of nowhere and all of that. But actually, they were part of large complexes, all basically dedicated to worship of the kings who were buried within them. So the idea was that once you were a king, when you died, you get your own cult. And the pyramid is usually the site of your cult. But there are also many temples dedicated to your cult. Cult doesn't mean creepy Jim Jones, Kool-Aid, that kind of cult. It simply means worship practices dedicated to one person or one idea. So every dead king gets to be the center of his own cult. There, everyone gets priests, you get festivals, and so your pyramid becomes part of these larger cult centers. And individual dynasties will have all their cult centers in one area. And this is a great picture. So it's online. I can show you where, but you can see how how the pyramid both goes down, around, and then inside. Now, not all the treasures are inside or under the pyramids. Some of them are around as well. So this is the tomb of Hetepheres, who was related to the fourth dynasty rulers. There's debates about whose mother she was or whose wife she was, but her tomb comes from the Giza pyramid complex. So she was obviously an important royal woman, and these are some of the treasures that were uncovered from her tomb. You can see there's a golden bed with a headrest, a chair, a long box, and she is notable, not just for getting to be buried with lots of beautiful gold things, but because she has the first canopic box that has been discovered, the oldest one. So this alabaster box contains canopic jars, which I'm sure a lot of you know what they are. They were buried with the dead, and there's frequently 4 of them, and they contain, the viscera. As we get into the New Kingdom, they become really specific. They are, have different animals and images on them. But this is the first example of one that is known, which is interesting because we're starting to see kind of early concepts of the journey of the afterlife, which we haven't really seen before. Now, one of the most interesting pyramids is actually one of the least exciting, and this is kind of my final concept that I'll give you. It's the Pyramid of Unas, who is a 5th dynasty ruler. His pyramid is small and unexciting from the outside, but on the inside, it is written all over with text detailing what is going to happen to Unas after he dies. So what is going to happen to the different aspects of his soul, the Ba and the Ka. And it tells all about that journey. Now, those are the first texts we have talking about what happens to the dead in the afterlife. Those texts are specifically for Unas, like they have nothing to do with anybody else. And it appears that kings were the only ones that anyone really considered their afterlife, what was going to happen with them. But as we get into later periods, we see that those texts, I'm just going to move forward really quick, on the Pyramid of Unas start appearing on regular people's coffins as well. So they become, the idea of the afterlife becomes adapted to a larger group of people. Now, the last point I'm going to make real quick is that with the pyramids and then and the 4th dynasty, we start to see attempts at that unnatural mummification, because now that we have bodies that are buried in these, stone tombs, they're obviously not decaying naturally. So we start to see efforts at mummification and ways to make the dead body look alive or resemble what it had looked like in life. And the key thing to remember about mummification in the Old Kingdom is that it generally doesn't work. And it doesn't look very good. It was trial and error. There really wasn't one precise way to do it. Most of the mummies don't really turn out. There's all sorts of different techniques, but as you can see, this really is kind of a far cry from what we associate with a really good-looking mummy. So mummification during this period is still at kind of a hazy phase. When we get to next week, we're going to be moving into the Middle and the New Kingdom, and we're going to see that mummification really develops and becomes more standardized. And along with that, the idea of the afterlife kind of fuses with the development of mummification techniques. So we start getting these very specific ideas of the journey of the different aspects of the soul after death. So I think I'm going to leave it there for now, and then we're going to continue with this next week because I want to make sure there's some time for questions. It's a lot, but we only have 2 classes for 3,000 years, so I'm going to go through some things pretty quickly. Yes? Like physically built them? Regular Egyptians who did not get commemorated at all. Unfortunately, here's some images. These are later. These are Middle Kingdom, but those are little models of workers. Those were the people who built the pyramids. They were laborers in the non-farming season. A lot of movies and theories and conspiracy theories and YouTube videos always like to say that like aliens came down and built the pyramids, because they always say, well, how is it possible that these primitive people could have built something so amazing? But it's actually really easy to think about that. By the time we get to the pyramids, we have centralized kings who are pretty wealthy, who have a lot of resources. They have rudimentary writing, and basically they have a lot of administrators. This is a kingdom, so they're able to exert power throughout, all of their lands, and it's like a pyramid scheme. They've got their chief administrators who have their regional administrators who are known as nomarchs, who have their local administrators who are able to round up labor. And they organize them the way any major building project would be organized. Most workers, they actually lived in pyramid towns, which were like mining towns. They would have, cooks and stores and bakers and, bunks for the men and all of that. And so it was just they're really a testament to the organization of the state.
But it'd be great many people die in the building.
Oh, sure.
The death rate was just horrendous.
Well, I'm sure lots of people died, but it was a dangerous time. And to be honest, I think that, you could die in a flood, you could be eaten by a crocodile. You could die farming too, you could die hunting, you could die in a war. But being a part of a pyramid, like living in a pyramid town, that was probably one of the earliest ways to move up the economic and social ladder, because you would learn skills. You would learn smithing skills, carving skills. You might acquire, some leadership roles, and you could really move up the ranks. So that's where we first start to see, kind of social mobility for those who survived. Other questions? Yes?
With over 1,500 deities in Egypt, and many are not named, are new deities being discovered even to this day?
Absolutely. New deities and new manifestations of deities as well. And new ways of depicting deities. Now, this was something that happened just, I want to say like 2 or 3 months ago. There was a really interesting part of a temple, I think, that was uncovered falcons, and there was an inscription, probably some of you read about this, that said, you know, there will be no beheading of falcons in this room, which, you know, indicates some kind of religious practice that we really didn't know about. But we're always discovering new deities and new ways of combining them as well. So one of the hallmarks, particularly of the New Kingdom, is that they tend to combine deities. So we'll get like Ra and Horus and just all these different ones sort of smushed together, and they all take on the attributes of each other. Absolutely. Sure. Yes?
What's the difference between a red and white crown? I missed that.
No worries. So the red crown is lower. That's a view of it from the side. It kind of goes up at the top and loops around, almost like a paper crown that rises up. And the white crown is like a bowling pin that goes in the middle. And we also have, can kind of see it there. There's a better picture here. It's like a stinger that comes out. So the crowns can be worn separately together with the bee sting or without it, all throughout.
One of those lower Egypt, upper Egypt.
Yes, but you can see, I mean, sometimes kings of both would wear one or the other. So you see all sorts of different depictions. This image here, where it's just the white crown and the smiting hose and a loincloth. So this is, this is Narmer. Going up to the late New Kingdom, you see Ramses the Great depicted exactly the same way. The crowns can be worn together separately. Yes?
Do you find it interesting that the Egyptians have pyramids and then in Central America they have pyramids?
So I am not an architect. I think it has to do, from what I've read, really with just the ease of construction and the way that it makes sense as a shape, especially when you look at some of those early bench-like tombs, and you just see them getting bigger, and that makes it that way too. I don't know that much about South American pyramids, but just as a rudimentary shape, I think it makes sense. It's also, once you have it, it looks really cool. It can be seen from a distance, so it's a great symbol of power. Now that's one of the reasons that pyramids probably went into decline, because they are such a great symbol of power, and they basically say lots of wealthy stuff buried right here, come and get it, and they kept getting robbed pretty early on. So by the time we get to the New Kingdom, kings and queens are starting to hide and bury their graves and their treasures, deep in the ground. They have, the craftsmen who work on them have like their own little isolated city. They want to keep it secret. They realize that pyramids are not such a great idea. Although, having said that, by the time we get to the late dynastic periods, pyramids do become more symbolic. They symbolize sort of Egyptian glory, because we get a series of kings who are invaders from the south. They're known as the Nubian pharaohs, and this is like almost 3,000 years later. They build mini pyramids for themselves. They're not even buried in them. They're buried outside them, just as a way to show that they are kind of part, at least spiritually, in line with some of the older kingdoms of Egypt. So they do take on that symbolic role later. Yes. Oh, yes.
To what extent did the common person, farmer, incorporate the belief system that you're describing, that I think of as being adopted by the royal families? Was it pervasive in all levels of society?
Do you mean in terms of sort of spirituality or religion?
Yes.
So that's a really good question. In all history, pre-industrial history, trying to get at what the common people believed is always difficult, because they tend to not be the ones leaving the sources. Most of the sources we have from ancient Egypt are pronouncements from the pharaoh or members of his court or the highest priest. One of the things that we see later when we get to sort of the Middle Kingdom at the earliest, we start to get just more evidence of writing and everyday writing, like notes and letters and things like that can give us slightly more insight into common people. For the Old Kingdom, I think it's really hard. How much did they believe? How much were they just forced to believe, and how much do we just not know because they don't leave any evidence? But one way to get to that, I think, is archaeologically, and that duality between the kingdoms and the intermediate periods, I think, is a good example. So if you just read Egyptian histories written by pharaohs themselves or their scribes, but coming from their court, the kingdoms are the periods of greatness and the intermediate periods are the times of disaster and chaos. Archaeologically, it looks like some of the outlying areas really thrived during the intermediate periods because they didn't have so much control. So that might be one way to see how, the kind of the standard view isn't necessarily, what everyone thought. Another way is archaeologically is to look at immigration. So when we get to the intermediate period going into the Middle Kingdom, we hear about invading groups and how when we finally get a kingdom again, regular dynasties, they destroy the invaders and they drive them out. Archaeologically, it looks like there were a lot of kind of foreigners coming from sort of the Mesopotamian area and like settling in Egypt and staying there for a fairly long period of time, and building towns and communities, and we see that fairly regularly. So that's a good question, and it's like, as a medievalist and an ancient historian of all periods, that's a constant one. Yes?
The step pyramid of Dozier was built by a physician administrator, as I understand, and often in freshman history class, they would start with that before they talked about the Giza pyramids and say there could be a link between that and the ziggurats of Sumeria. Have you heard about that?
Well, yeah. So Imhotep is, sort of the great architect administrator who's credited with it, and he's worshipped later as a god, really. As sort of like an artist and medicinal god later. And so he's definitely when you asked who built the pyramids. They're credited to the pharaohs, but the pharaohs, of course, were delegating this to administrators who had, sort of the talent to get it organized and built, and then they're the ones organizing the labor. So definitely, I would say Imhotep probably, it was his design rather than Sneferu's. In terms of the link with the ziggurats, I don't know for sure, but there's a lot of links culturally and economically between Mesopotamia and Egypt going back and going forward, including writing, the use of seals, the use of lapis lazuli. Even different gods go back and forth. Hathor, who is a really early goddess, who's a cattle goddess, who is frequently depicted with horns. Her depiction affects the way a Mesopotamian goddess, she later becomes Astarte, is depicted, that she kind of takes on the attributes of Hathor. And then Seth, who is more of a kind of like a Middle Eastern god, he comes and becomes more of a, is brought into Egypt. So there are a ton of connections, so I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know if it can be proven, but it certainly is quite plausible. Okay, I saw one back there.
We can talk about the Sphinx, but I understand it's around the same time.
Yes. So this. Well, how about you save it for next time? But until then, I will just leave you. There we go. So here we have Giza. We have the three major. These are the three big pyramids, and it's part of that ceremonial complex that. Oh, sorry, that's super sensitive. That we've looked at. But yes, because next time I really want to focus on pharaohs and rulers. So you sort of anticipated me. All right. Yes. Hi. Yeah. So that's a great question. Of the rulers, Tutankhamun comes during the New Kingdom, so we're going to actually cover him next time. He is much later than this period that we've been talking about. He comes from the 19th dynasty, and he is one of those kings, as basically his whole family that I mentioned at the beginning, that had to be reinserted into the king list because they had been obliterated. So that 30 dynasty setup comes from a few different sources, but basically king lists from from antiquity. And those king lists leave out much of the 19th and some of the 20th century dynastic rulers because they simply weren't correct in various ways. They leave out Hatshepsut. They leave out all the Amarna controversy rulers who were kind of these heretic rulers, including Tutankhamun's predecessors, and they just skip them when kings are depicted on temples, and that's what sort of like late Egyptian priests based their king list on. So he was sort of rediscovered in the early 20th century. All right, I think that's actually all we've got time for, but I'll hang out up here and answer questions individually. And if there's anything anyone really wants me to touch on next time, then just let me know. Thank you.
I will put any handouts on our website.